Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Ryan Kairalla. A bit of personal news for all of you this week. I'm pretty excited to report that my 3-year-old son, Nathan, read his first sentence this week. You'll be hard-pressed to find a greater thrill than watching your little one recite, "The cat in the hat sat on the mat," off a paper for the very first time. Naturally, the topic of reading education is on the top of my mind, and I hope that you all are as eager as I am to learn about short and long-term approaches to help students become fluent readers. Joining us for that discussion this week is Carolyn Brown, the Chief Academic Officer and co-founder of Foundations in Learning, an organization whose mission is to unlock educational opportunity for all students by providing teachers and students with best-in-class literacy tools that leverage the science of learning. You can find out more about our guest's work by visiting wordflight.com. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, the pleasure is also very much on this side of the microphone. I'm excited for this discussion for all the reasons that I just described in my intro there. I'm thinking a lot about reading lately. And since I was talking about my little son, who has now begun his own journey into literacy, I'm a little curious, and I'd like to start things off with a question about educating the very youngest of readers. What are some of the earliest things that we should be doing in education to help the littlest of our readers set up the foundational skills for literacy?
It is a perfect question. And you warmed my heart when I heard you talking about your 3-year-old already engaged in reading and literacy. But clearly, the most important foundation is oral language. It is talking with your children from the moment they're born. And actually, it's never too early to have a book by your side as well. And I speak both from the point of view of a reading researcher and a grandparent. So I have grandchildren just about the age of your son, and it is the greatest thrill, actually, to be engaged in watching them every day or every other day, what they're learning. But it comes from that engaging interaction with the parent, with siblings, with grandparents, that begin building the foundations of literacy, which is oral language. That is the best predictor of how well they're going to do when they get into that literacy environment. So there are very simple things that you can do to make that the very best. Listen carefully, let them take turns, find out what they love and know about, and build stories with them around that. Play silly songs with them, get them used to saying those silly twisters and rhyming songs, because that gets them ready to pull sounds apart when they get into reading. And I think maybe as most important as anything is just always be ready to read with them. And as you cuddle up in the evening or you're in the car going someplace, telling stories, but also reading them together is just, it's not only joyful, you're putting in place all the foundations to get ready to read.
It's my favorite time of the day. Reading time with mom and dad before bed is something that not only my son looks forward to, but I'd say his parents certainly look forward to it too. And
Yes.
I'm also happy to hear that oral language and being exposed to it is an early indicator of literacy, because in my house he has a dad that talks way too much. So I'm happy to know that with all the talking I do, I'm doing something for literacy as well.
Oh, absolutely. There is no question. That is the foundation.
So one of the things I've always wanted to talk to somebody in your field about is, I would say that of any field of learning science, literacy comes with the most conventional wisdom and preconceived notions about how it works that tends to have a lot of myths around it. So are there any commonly held beliefs in your view when it comes to reading education that some people have, that some of your colleagues might have, that just aren't backed up by the science?
So, I mean, you are stepping into one big sort of conflict, and it's been talked about a lot. It's how do you get students ready to read? And there have been differing views. And most recently, and I would say over the past decade especially, the science of reading has documented really carefully, and I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first is many children must have structured literacy instruction. They have to have explicit instruction in the beginning to actually make the connection between the sounds and letters. And that's called early decoding. Some people know it as phonics instruction, but that is a really critical first piece to put into place. There have been, the swing of the pendulum from whole language, where they're going to just from lots of rich environments with oral language, and print, they'll pull that out, all the way to, it's really important that you have in those early classrooms that very explicit instruction. Data show most children need that in the beginning. Part two, that is not enough. Children also must practice, and all practice is not created equally. So what the science of learning brings to us is the value of practice, but it also tells us, and this is a real important discussion that's just coming, I think, into its own place in the science of reading that will enhance the science of reading. That is that automatic behaviors, skilled behaviors that are complex, need practice. And that practice is defined by the science of learning in certain ways that actually give us the roadmap and the principles that we have to put into place. So it is not just practice, it is practice designed to get to fluency. And that is what I have actually spent the past 15 years with my co-founder husband, Jerry Zimmerman, and a whole group of colleagues from the University of Iowa, trying to figure out how we can push that forward now with the science of reading to expand the reach.
When it comes to practicing reading, are there any, for lack of a better word, best practices that you're seeing that tend to be very effective things for young readers to do to build those early skills?
So very early on, as we talked, they need to be able to play with the sounds of language, of words, and understand how to pull those apart. And whenever they have those activities and experiences, I mean, your son is primed, I'm sure, to be a perfect student, because you play with him, you play sound games with him, you're helping him to distinguish those sounds in his own language, and you are interacting with him so that you're naturally pointing him in a right direction with all the love and care of a parent to move in that direction. But I think that one of the things that we know is that once children come into school and they begin to have what's called phonemic awareness, that is sound awareness, then you can begin to help them understand how to make that correspondence to print. And then very soon, you need to move into this practice mode, which means, and I'm going to give you, and if this is too much information, you can raise your hand and say, okay, enough.
No,
But
I love this.
there are 6 principles that we've been studying, and they are, don't just give, when they begin to read, our tendency is to want to pull back and narrow it so that we help them get exactly right and understand it. But what they actually need is many contexts, many tasks in which they can practice that concept you're trying to teach them, whether it's which consonants go and on the letter, which letters go with which sounds, or whether it's how words work in syllables, or all of these different components, how words form a sentence. And they need to see many different tasks so they can begin themselves in that practice to pull that out. Because if they learn it and they practice it, one of the principles is not only vary the task, but also elaborate. So they're putting it into long-term memory by thinking about it, by understanding it, not just by doing the very same thing every day until they get to mastery. And so we're really pushing those principles and I won't go into a lot of detail, but there's something called desirable difficulties. And with the 3-year-old, you wouldn't push them into difficulties with print. But whenever you're in the kindergarten or first grade, getting them to understand how something works, you have to push them a little bit. And you need to know how to control that. And those are some of the principles that the science of learning can talk to us about.
I appreciate that perspective, and I love sort of just kind of mentally checking off. Okay, am I doing that with my son? Could I do it more? Could I do it less? This is all really, really valuable. You had mentioned earlier that key to achieving early literacy in kids is making sure that we have that kind of explicit reading instruction in those early grades. But I've heard it as explained as we have to teach children to learn to read in the early elementary grades, so that in the later grades they can learn how to read to learn.
Yeah.
And, but that being said, I think there's probably, and I'm sure you'd agree, there is still an important role for those non-explicit reading teachers in those early elementary grades to play to support student literacy. What are some of those teachers for the teachers that are listening out there that aren't the reading teachers in those K through 2 grades, but are still teaching other content areas? What are some of the things that they could be doing? What strategies could they be doing to support literacy for those young kids?
So I'm going to sound like I'm repeating a little bit, but those teachers who are teaching science or social studies have a ripe opportunity to teach vocabulary. They have a very wonderful way to connect to what that student knows and to affirm what they know, but then to get them to think beyond that. So they may be teaching a story about some village, and they might say, how is this like your home? What kinds of foods do they eat, and how does that compare to what you do? But what you're doing is you're building those connections, and every one of those interactions is making these neural networks and pathways stronger. So whenever they actually come to the written word, they're drawing on that same information and they're connecting it and they're coordinating all these linguistic systems. So even if you're not the reading teacher, you can help them understand contrasts, similarities, and differences. You can help them relate to what they already know and to build on that. And you can affirm, and many of these students who struggle sometimes with reading, it is seeing that they are using that information and having a teacher say, what a great thought that is. You just jumped a big hurdle here. I think everybody should recognize how important it is, that connection that you made. And that gives students motivation and support and a belief in themselves as a learner and a reader.
That's really interesting. I mean, it would not have immediately clicked for me that what you just described there, non-content areas teachers, or sorry, content area teachers teaching things like helping students find connection points in material or relevance to their life, would be a literacy skill. Can you elaborate a bit on how those particular experiences for a kid help them become better readers?
Sure. So knowing that the oral language structures are the first sort of neural networks that are put into place, and knowing that when you're reading words, and once you get to a place where you have the ability to automatically recognize words, and we haven't talked much about that, which is what most of our work has been centered on, is that making sure that students actually make those connections in a way that the brain is doing this coordination so that they're making sense of these sounds and letters, but soon they begin to recognize patterns. If those patterns are seen in different ways, those get integrated. But if you already have a neural network there that has lots of words in syntax or sentence structure or content, then you're touching and you're expanding and coordinating with what you already know with those new words that you're learning about. So it is always building more language connections, stronger links that can always support literacy, because literacy in the end, even though beginning to read is very specific and very deliberate, both in terms of instruction and practice, in the end, it is the meaning that we extract that gets us on that road of loving to read, reading to learn. So all of those pieces about oral language, vocabulary development, syntax or sentence structure, all of those play a really, really important part as a student is learning to read.
And word recognition beyond just the way we see words when we do phonics is certainly important. You know, my own son is having his early experiences with that, to some amount of frustration when I had to explain to him that the word cereal, as in breakfast cereal, does not start with a s sound. It was quite a fight in our household. He's only just emotionally recovered from that. That's the sort of thing you'd only know if you got exposed to the word. But let me move a little bit further down the academic line here. As we get into the later grades, certain different types of reading skills become more important, and we can sort of break down skills into different areas when you get into those later years. And that's when we might start seeing gaps in those older students' abilities, where they might be higher in one reading skill versus another. And so can you talk a little bit about what reading skills we are seeing the biggest gaps among older students, and what are some of the things that we can do in the schools to help bridge those gaps?
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a great question. And unfortunately, we have too many youngsters in upper elementary and middle school who don't have those firm foundations that we spoke about earlier. They are either missing decoding skills, so what should be a very flexible generative system with the sound symbol system that we use, the alphabet system, it becomes very rigid and hard, and they're not generalizing, they're not seeing connections, either because they don't have good decoding skills or because they cannot generalize, they can't get to automatic word recognition, which is an essential part of fluency. And you cannot use print for comprehension if you aren't fluent. If you have students in middle school who are sounding out those sounds word by word, all their cognitive energy is going into unpacking or decoding that word. What we want is a smooth and automatic word recognition that allows them to not pay attention to that. And the only way to get that to happen is to proceduralize that, so they get enough practice that all of those patterns that the brain is designed to detect begin to come into not just accurate decoding, but it actually allows them to become flexible so that they can see that pattern in new words, or they can see that pattern as they're putting two syllables together. And those patterns and pattern recognition is really what our brain is designed to do, and to do well. And so that practice component, we have found that by using technology, we can use that to actually help build those connections in a way that you can't do one-on-one as a teacher in many ways, because it takes many, many repetitions and exposures. And it's not just repetitions, it is designed so that those contrasts begin to, and the regularities pop. And whenever that happens and they begin to see how language is generative, all of a sudden, and it is this incredible, we know that they begin with declaratory or very early explicit instruction. And then there is this period in between of practice. And then at the end, we can look at the brain scans and see that it's consolidated and coordinated. And it's only then that you have automatic word recognition. And we know the way to build that automatic word recognition to get to fluency is through very systematic practice. And that is what we have been studying and working with scientists for the past 15 years to do. So that's a question that's very close to my heart and home and work, trying to make sure that all children get to the point that they can read for meaning, that their focus when they see words is not on unpacking that word, but automatically recognizing it so they're engaged in the sentence and in the meaning.
The feeling is definitely mutual there. Before we get to our final question this week, love to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the work that you do with Foundations in Learning.
The work that we do is to actually work with teachers and principals to, first of all, I will, since you ask, I will tell you, we were funded by IES, the Institute for Education Science, to actually, for these middle schools, try to figure out, do they have decoding problems or do they have use problems? Can they get it, but they can't use it well and flexibly enough to get automatic? And so they funded research, a 3-year project where we developed and tested and validated a diagnostic. And that diagnostic allows us to see where their deficits are in decoding and whether or not they are automatic. And we have a patented diagnostic for that purpose. And then we took that research and we took it down and began looking at 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders as well. So that allows us to identify where the problem is and then to very specifically target it for individual children by using the power of technology. Our goal with technology is not to tie these children to screens for their entire life or their entire day. It's 20 minutes a day. And we have shown that in a year's time, we can get these children caught up with both decoding and transferring to automaticity in just a year. So that's our goal, and that's where our work has primarily been focused, but it is to make meaning come alive from print.
Our guest this week has been Dr. Carolyn Brown, the Chief Academic Officer and co-founder of Foundations in Learning. You can find out more about our guest's work by visiting wordflight.com. Dr. Brown, this has been a treat. And before we let you go, I'd love to ask you one more question. Yeah. If with the snap of your fingers, you could make any change to the education system, what change would it be?
Well, I might do 2 snaps.
You've earned it. Go for it.
First thing that I would do is it would be wonderful to have a national focus on early language and literacy and learning development. And that's what I would do first. That is where the foundations begin. That is where we get the most for what we put in. It is the best predictor is how well we build those first skills in language. And then the next thing I would do is, if I could, I would reduce the time from the work coming out in the science, the evidence that's coming from research, to how long it takes to get to practice. Because unlike medicine, education doesn't have this pipeline that is started with a clinical trial, and then it gets to evidence, and then it gets translated, and then it gets pushed down. And even that takes sometimes 10 years to translate that. But last week I was at a meeting at AIM Institute, and they are an example of someone who has really committed to trying to find what the science is and translate it quickly. It was founded by 2 wonderful women, Pat Roberts and Nancy Blair, and both of them had daughters who had dyslexia. And they said if they talked to a lot of people and they learned how long it takes to translate this research, especially for children who need more help. And they said 10 years, we cannot wait 10 years. Our children will be already through all of these early reading programs. And so they began this program that actually, they try to shorten that time. But if we could nationally figure out a way by teaching our pre-service teachers about cognitive science, about linguistics, about language development. Use the expertise of speech pathologists in school. And whenever they go into the schools, they are more prepared to understand the science as it comes through. So that was a long answer for 2 quick snaps.
They were 2 excellent snaps is what they are. Really appreciate your thoughts on that. And I can tell you most of the ed professors and ed policy folks in my network are all just furiously nodding their head in agreement on that front. A lot of what we do is, planting trees whose shade we won't be able to sit under because it takes a long time for the theory to find its way into action. And anything we can do to speed up that process would be a welcome development. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It was a pleasure being here with you. Your questions were intriguing and thought-provoking. Thank you.
Well, I'd say the same thing about your answers. I know I enjoyed them. I know the people viewing and listening did as well. And to those people, I would say thank you all for checking out Big Ideas in Education. We'll see you next time.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.